I'm a filmmaker from Brooklyn, New York. I am currently 27 years old, but I was 20 years old when I shot Sunken Roads. I was born in 1994 and grew up lucky to be the daughter of two filmmakers. I shot the film when I was a sophomore in undergrad, so my second year. I had become increasingly interested in World War II history at college, and I also was fascinated with the story of my great grandfather who fought on D-Day. And as those two interests kind of collided, the film was born. I'd been actually interested in military history, I want to say since fifth grade. I was interested in the history of the American Civil War and particularly the memory of the American Civil War. And that was just a childhood interest that became more serious as I got older. And then I would say as a teenager, I became really interested in the First World War and oral histories of the war, and actually a lot of really amazing Australian writing about the war. So then when I was in college, I took a class that changed my life with Professor Jay Winter about the two world wars, one and two, and really focusing on the human experience, on diaries, letters, novels, first person accounts. And so it was in that context that my interest in World War II history kind of emerged. I've always loved history. Ever since I was a little kid, I've been passionate about history. I grew up in my mother's house is a really, really old house. And I just grew up always just imagining the lives of the people who would have lived in the house and just thinking about what my neighborhood might have been like 100 years ago, further ago. I just have always loved that. And so I got really into reading diaries and letters and compilations of diaries and letters. And so my interest in military history, I kind of stumbled into that, but first and foremost, my interest in history is always grounded in a sense of individual stories and when it comes to military history, I've been more interested in the memory of the war, the cost of war, what that actually does to communities and families, rather than, being interested in kind of military strategy or technology or things like that. I would say the cinema verite films of the French New Wave, and also verite films from the 80s in the US, like Sherman's March, were really inspirational to me going in. I would say the two films that inspired me the most were Sherman's March by Ross McElwee and Faces Places by Agnes Varda. Agnes Varda's films in general were hugely influential for me, both in the shooting process and throughout post-production. One thing I love about films by those filmmakers and others kind of in that cinema verite school is that you always have a sense that this is not a kind of voice of God documentary telling you the official history of XYZ. It's a very subjective, personal piece of art where you're always aware as a viewer that there's a person behind the camera and that anything that you're seeing is a result of kind of a mediated interaction. Like there's the camera, there's someone behind the camera, and then there's the subject, and it's not an objective view of anything. And I always appreciated that sense of transparency. And so in the edit, we really tried to kind of capture that by repeatedly breaking the illusion that the audience is viewing anything objective. I think that people engage with history a little differently in my generation. And I think that sometimes there can be frustration on the part of older generations that people in younger generations aren't picking up on the same types of historical narratives that worked for them. So, for instance, I think a lot of people in my generation, rhetoric like the greatest generation can be kind of alienating. It can be a little bit like, well, especially if you never knew them, like, well, then, they're the best. They're up on this pedestal. They're almost these kind of monumental figures that you can barely emotionally relate to. They seem so stoic and so perfect and so like uber masculine in a way that it's very hard to engage with. But I think that for this film, what I was hoping to do was to show that generation, that older generation of folks in their 90s, as real human beings, as like vulnerable, funny, emotional, alive, tangible people who are interested in sharing things with you and meeting halfway to do so. Because I think one of the things about the veterans in this film is that, it wasn't just me being interested in reaching to try to understand their generation. They were very much willing to kind of have these conversations with me and very interested in engaging me as well. So it's very much a two-way street, I think. I do hope that the film will serve as kind of a reminder to my generation that, like, just because something seemed dry when you learned it in history class doesn't mean that it is inherently dry. If you take the initiative to try to figure it out for yourself, there's a lot to be found. For people in my generation, if they have seen Saving Private Ryan, that beginning part, that landing scene, might be the salient image in terms of what that war was like on an emotional level. Things might have changed since I was in high school, obviously. But I remember spending maybe 2 days on World War II. In the context, I remember taking like world history and US history, and I think that you touch on it in both, but it's very brief. And understandably, there's a lot of, and I don't mean to say this in a negative way at all, there's a lot of focus on the Holocaust, which I think matters a massive amount. But when you only have a couple of days to spend on it and you want to convey the horrors of the Holocaust, that leaves incredibly little room for anything else at all. My memories of studying World War II in high school for school, as opposed to like reading things on my own, was just kind of a desperate attempt to memorize names, dates, battles, facts, generals, stuff like that. And that is not doing that, in my experience at least, was never going to be an engaging process. It's like you're cramming for a test and you're desperate to get that information in. And, I think that compared to children in Normandy, the war was on their land. This is the story of their hometowns. It feels incredibly immediate, and they've been learning about it in a very emotionally engaged way since early childhood. It's just there's no comparison, really. The more that kind of high school and younger history education can be grounded in stories that people will actually find interesting and be able to relate to their own lives, the more that people will actually develop a long-lasting interest in these subjects. One of the things I'm most excited about with Sunken Roads is getting it into schools and having it be a film that would supplement that kind of more fact-based history education. Because I think that Sunken Roads is the kind of thing where I'm hoping that it will allow people who are even younger than me to feel like they get to know these guys as if they knew them in their personal life. And I know that for me, because I never knew my great-grandfather who inspired the film, becoming close friends with the veterans who are the characters of Sunken Roads allowed me to feel as if I had known my great-grandfather. And that's what I want for children who'd be encountering Sunken Roads in an educational context.